Welcome to Dialogue. This conversation is part of a series on the analysis of the COVID era, and today we're focusing on something that is, I think, profoundly important: the systemic and almost total lack of accountability that followed.
It's a critical topic
Mm.
because, as chaotic and intense as those years were, what happened after the storm passed? Well, that's arguably far more revealing about how modern power actually works when the pressure is finally off.
Okay, let's just dive right into that because there's a stunning paradox at the center of this, isn't there?
There really is.
For 2 years, we lived through this incredibly disruptive, globally coordinated event. We saw massive institutional changes, public policy decisions made with, unbelievable speed and certainty.
Right, decisions that changed every aspect of our lives.
Exactly. And then at the end of it all, when the dust settled and the emergency declaration started to lapse, something truly remarkable happened.
Nothing.
Essentially nothing, just this deafening silence.
It's a silence that's deeply unsettling when you contrast it with the noise of the years before. You'd expect some kind of reckoning.
You would. You'd expect official inquiries, maybe a 9/11 style commission, certainly high-profile hearings. You'd expect resignations over policies that caused so much collateral damage.
Maybe even just a few meaningful apologies for the overreach. Just an acknowledgement.
But instead, what we got was this sort of collective shrug. The message from institutions, from society, was basically, let's just move on. Treat the whole thing like a bad dream we should all agree to forget.
And that really is the mission of this deep dive. We're not here to call for retribution or, revenge against any one person.
No, this is analytical.
Purely analytical. We need to understand the systemic mechanisms, the cultures inside these organizations that allowed so much power to be used so quickly, only to then completely evade any kind of scrutiny when it was all over.
And this is where it gets really important for the future. The real danger isn't just the mistakes that were made during the crisis. Because, look, mistakes are inevitable in an emergency.
Of course, information is scarce, pressure is high.
Right. The true danger is setting a precedent. It's establishing a playbook that says institutions can exercise maximum power, cause widespread and documented harm, and then just skip the consequences.
And if a system can't force itself to self-correct, if the culture actually rewards forgetting its failures to protect reputations, well, that creates a profoundly dangerous template for the next crisis.
It doesn't just mean the same errors might happen again.
No, it almost guarantees they'll be seen as a standard low-risk way to operate next time power gets centralized.
So let's start with the scale of the damage. Because to really understand how enormous the accountability vacuum is, you first have to remember the scope of what was actually disrupted.
Right. We're not talking about small administrative errors here.
Not at all. We're talking about broad, substantial societal harm that hit almost every part of civic and private life at the same time.
The impacts were just immense. We saw free speech curtailed in ways that were really subtle, often using private platforms as intermediaries, which we should definitely dig into later.
And the effect was immediate. It was chilling.
Absolutely. And then you had careers, entire livelihoods just destroyed. Small business owners, people in the service industry, gone. Often from mandates that, when you look back, lacked a clear public health rationale that could justify that level of economic cost.
And the harm done to children. To an entire generation, really, from prolonged school closures. That's maybe the hardest to quantify because the damage is deferred, it's cumulative.
But the evidence is undeniable now. The setbacks in education, in social development, in mental health,
Yeah.
that's going to be with us for a very, very long time.
Beyond the measurable stuff, though, the intangible losses were huge, too.
That's a great point. Think about the aggressive erosion of public trust in our core institutions, public health bodies, the media, you name it.
And the politicization of science. That was staggering, where a dissenting scientific view wasn't just seen as part of the debate.
It was treated as heresy, as dangerous disinformation that had to be stamped out, not engaged with. That leaves a deep structural wound on a society.
So you have all these massive impacts, the kind of thing that would normally trigger national commissions, deep internal reviews. Yet the balance sheet for who was responsible is basically empty.
It's completely blank. And that gets to this really sharp observation.
Right. Which is that, well, if everyone is responsible,
Then nobody is. Exactly. It's the perfect diffusion of blame.
it sounds just like a project at a huge company that goes completely off the rails.
That's the perfect analogy, actually. Imagine a massive project fails, costs billions. In a focused company, the CEO or the division head is on the hook.
Right. Someone is held accountable.
But in a diffuse bureaucratic system, The failure runs through 20 different offices. The legal department signed off here, logistics signed off there, the health authority gave the rationale, the political leaders gave the final okay.
So when you look back and ask who's responsible,
Question isn't who, it's where. And the responsibility never settles anywhere. It just dissipates.
it becomes liquid. It just flows away from any single point of consequence.
That is the nature of blame in large modern organizations. It makes the system itself virtually consequence-proof. And to be clear, we're not talking about punishing good faith errors made under pressure.
No, this is about the failure to even audit the errors, to track where the decision-making broke down so you can fix it for next time.
Precisely. And that highlights the difference between a functional, self-correcting society and one that's stuck in crisis mode. In a functional society, mistakes produce accountability. They lead to reviews, changes in protocol. The mistake is a data point.
But in this case, as we saw, the mistakes only produced excuses. And those excuses were designed specifically to shut down any real inquiry.
And that inability to learn is the fatal flaw. Accountability isn't about punishment. It's an operational necessity for a system to get better. Without it, you are just doomed to repeat the cycle.
Let's talk about those excuses then. The deflection mechanisms that were put up almost instantly. You heard them everywhere, from officials, from academics, the media.
The holy trinity of excuses.
We didn't know. It was unprecedented. We did our best under difficult circumstances. It was like an institutional mantra, a shield.
They're what you could call the emergency get-out-of-jail-free cards. They're ready-made rhetorical tools to deflect responsibility before a real conversation can even start.
The whole strategy relies on you accepting that the situation was so unique, so challenging, that failure was inevitable. So why bother looking too closely at the choices that were made?
But that defense just crumbles when you actually scrutinize it. The virus itself was unprecedented, sure, but many of the policies, the censorship of credentialed experts, the sheer length and severity of school closures, they were carried out with a level of absolute certainty that we now know was completely unwarranted.
And often actively harmful.
Exactly. And this is really where you have to challenge the core of those excuses. They're using uncertainty as a shield for the policy failure.
Right. We didn't know, so we had to do something.
Precisely. But the deeper truth, I think, is that uncertainty should never be an excuse to shut people up.
It should be the opposite.
It's the absolute opposite. I mean, uncertainty is the very reason you need more voices, more debate. You need open, rigorous discussion, precisely because no one knows the right answer yet.
That is the pivotal point. If we are genuinely in uncharted territory, you need all the competing hypotheses on the table. You need all the critical voices testing them.
To demand ideological conformity based on the official narrative of the day, that doesn't show strength or competence. It shows a profound intellectual weakness. It shows a lack of confidence in your own policy.
I think a lot of people felt that intuitively. If an institution was really confident in its position, it wouldn't need to censor people for discussing alternative data.
Of course not. When you're genuinely confident, you welcome scrutiny. It validates your finding. When you're operating on a mix of panic and political certainty, scrutiny feels like an existential threat.
The moment the conversation shifted from let's test this to this is settled and you can't challenge it, the accountability mechanism was already breaking down.
That's when the intellectual failure happened. And it was justified by the very uncertainty it should have been designed to manage.
Okay, let's move on to the government sphere specifically. The strategy they used to avoid accountability was, well, it wasn't some grand announcement. It was far more subtle.
It was a bureaucratic masterpiece of sleight of hand. The strategy was to revise history without ever admitting a single fault.
Policies that had massive social and economic consequences, mandates, restrictions, they were just quietly dropped or allowed to lapse without any fanfare.
And the public guidance, which had been delivered with such moral certainty, was slowly softened. Tweaked, updated month by month, disguised as just a routine operational change.
You had policies that were enforced with the full weight of the state fines, business closures, just vanish.
Yeah.
But there was never a press conference where an official said, you know what, we were wrong about this.
Or, our data showed this measure wasn't nearly as effective as we thought, and we apologize for the harm it caused. Never.
No, the language was just softened until the original hard line was basically unrecognizable. But it was never formally corrected as an error.
And that strategy is so important because it lets the institution look like it's responding to new data while completely protecting its history. They get to say, the guidance changed because the science evolved.
Instead of, our guidance was flawed from the beginning.
Exactly. It's a strategy designed to save face and preserve political careers, not to provide transparency to the public.
And this brings us to that perfect, darkly humorous summary of the process that really sticks with you.
Oh, it's brilliant.
The CDC didn't change its mind, it updated its vibe.
It just captures the institutional priority perfectly. They clearly calculated that being seen as wrong was a more dangerous outcome for their reputation than the reality of having been harmful to the public.
Because admitting an error invites liability. It invites scrutiny.
Right. Rebranding, on the other hand, lets you maintain the illusion of being constantly correct, just in a state of evolving guidance. It's always one step ahead.
Let's look at the mechanism. A governor issues a binding executive order for closures. If they later admit that order was based on flawed models,
They're opening themselves up to massive lawsuits from every business that failed under that order.
but if they just let the order expire quietly and then issue new, softer guidance a month later, they avoid admitting any legal liability for what happened in the past.
That is the critical distinction. It's a strategy of passive retraction.
Uh-huh.
The original harmful policy is never actually adjudicated, and those who suffered under it never get the validation of an official error being acknowledged.
And future policymakers don't get a clear marker of do not repeat this. They just get the playbook for low liability, zero accountability crisis management.
Exactly.
Now let's dig into the specific mechanics around free speech, because this is where it gets really intricate. We know dissent was silenced, but why didn't major First Amendment lawsuits lead to a huge systemic reckoning for the government?
Because this was a masterclass in modern strategic evasion. The key here is that the censorship was overwhelmingly indirect.
So not a direct government order.
No. Governments figured out they didn't need to issue formal, legally binding mandates to shut people up. That's messy. It's obviously illegal. Instead, they could leverage third parties.
The tech platform.
The social media giants. They could get these private companies to do the heavy lifting of narrative control for them.
So instead of a direct violation of the Constitution, which requires state action, they used informal pressure. What did that look like, specifically?
It was a whole spectrum of actions. It was high-level meetings between government officials and platform executives framed as discussions about, public health safety. It was issuing guidance documents that outlined what content was considered dangerous.
And that guidance carried an implicit threat.
A very powerful one. The subtext was always, if you don't manage this content the way we want, we might have to step in and regulate you much more aggressively.
So if you're a platform executive, you think it's much cheaper and easier for me to just remove these 10,000 posts than it is to fight the government on antitrust for the next 5 years.
Precisely. The government gets its goal, the suppression of speech, without leaving a clean, legally actionable fingerprint of a constitutional violation.
The government can claim they were just offering expert guidance.
And the platforms can claim they were just enforcing their own terms of service to create a safe environment. It's a perfect loop of deniability.
You can't sue a cloud. And that's the system they created. The liability just vanishes into the ether between the public and private sectors.
Which brings us to that metaphor that just perfectly encapsulates this legal fog. Everyone touched the levers, so no one pulled it.
When a legal challenge finally comes, no single actor, not the agency, not the official, not the platform, can be definitively pinned as the one responsible for the censorship.
And that makes both legal and political accountability almost impossible to establish. The legal trail just dead ends in a loop of mutual deflection, leaving the speech suppressed and everyone involved free of consequence.
It's a critical lesson in how contemporary power works. Direct commands are risky. Indirect influence, leveraged through massive private infrastructure, is clean, effective, and consequence-free.
It's evasion, not violation. A whole new playbook.
Okay, let's pivot to the corporate side of this, starting with those tech platforms. They had this incredibly complex dual role, and they played both sides of the accountability coin perfectly.
It was a masterful strategic position. On one hand, they're claiming neutrality, independence, the moral high ground of protecting users from harmful misinformation.
But on the other hand, they were simultaneously following very detailed, often explicit government guidance on exactly what content needed to be removed or suppressed.
And we have to talk about their motivation here. It wasn't just altruistic public service, despite the press releases.
No. Platforms profited enormously from the crisis environment. The heightened engagement, the constant refreshing, the fear. It's all rocket fuel for their business model.
Fear and polarization drive clicks better than calm consensus ever will. The crisis was a perfect storm for their bottom line. It was an unprecedented chance for them to become not just conduits of information, but indispensable arbiters of truth.
Which dramatically increased their relevance, their user base, their valuation. Crisis equals eyeballs, and eyeballs equal profit.
It's a cynical calculation, but a very effective one. So while they acted as censors for the state, they desperately needed plausible deniability to protect their image of neutrality.
And this brings us to the observation that just perfectly captures their rhetorical gymnastics.
The corporate euphemism of the decade.
They weren't censoring, they were optimizing trust.
It's magnificent. It sounds fantastic on a quarterly earnings call, doesn't it? Our trust and safety optimizations have delivered exceptional results. It makes a massive intervention sound like a simple algorithm update.
But the outcome is so stark. Despite this immense, unprecedented power they wielded in shaping the global narrative.
Zero penalties.
No penalties for overreach, no requirement for transparency about their decisions, no restitution for the people harmed by their enforcement.
They gained more power, more profit, and faced zero accountability. They proved they could effectively become an arm of state power without any of the legal or political consequences the state itself would face.
Now let's look at traditional media. Their role in this accountability vacuum was just as critical. Many mainstream outlets seem to shift almost overnight from their traditional role of skepticism to one of, well, amplifying false certainty.
They became incredibly confident, sometimes aggressively so, about complex scientific issues that were, in reality, still highly uncertain and evolving. They often mocked or dismissed dissenting views, even from credentialed experts.
So why this aggressive certainty?
Because the immediate reward structure of modern media is built for it. Nuance is slow. It's boring. It doesn't get clicks. Outrage and certainty, even if they're wrong later, trend immediately.
Which is captured by that very punchy insight. Corrections don't trend, outrage does.
The entire business model, the clicks, the views, the ad revenue, is designed to amplify the initial high-impact, simplistic claim. The long-term accuracy is almost irrelevant to the business model.
Think about the number of early reports that were just plain wrong, or at least far too simplistic. The certainty about surface transmission, the timeline of vaccine efficacy, the insistence on the virus's origin.
And once the facts shifted, did we see any meaningful, industry-wide internal reviews? Did we see major outlets dedicating segments to, here's where our initial coverage was flawed, and here's what we learned?
No, they just pivoted. They moved on to the next crisis, the next angle, and let their past mistakes just vanish down the memory hole of the 24-hour news cycle.
And that vanishing memory protects the careers of journalists and the profits of the institutions. But it leaves the public constantly cycling through uncorrected information with their trust misplaced.
The consequence is that the public doesn't learn who to trust. If a major outlet makes a huge error but never admits it, they keep the public's trust, only to potentially repeat the same mistake in the next crisis.
It's a self-perpetuating cycle of zero accountability. Accountability in media would require slowing down and admitting fault, which means losing the attention battle. And since attention is their currency, they chose the currency over the correction.
Let's turn to the scientific and academic community now, because this is perhaps the most worrying part of the accountability vacuum. This is where the integrity of knowledge creation itself was compromised.
We saw an institutional failure within the academic and research communities to do the one thing they claim to champion: rigorous, skeptical, self-correcting review. This was a chance for science to show its honesty under pressure, and instead it largely chose silence and deflection.
For instance, major scientific journals that rushed to publish accelerated research, they later actively avoided publishing comprehensive critical retrospectives on their own initial positions or their rapid review processes.
They rushed to publish the urgent findings, but never paused to re-examine the mechanism of the rush itself.
In universities, which impose some of the strictest and longest-lasting mandates, they mostly avoided any deep, systemic reviews of their own policies. Why?
Because a university, especially a major endowed one, operates like a massive corporation. Accountability for past decisions could undermine the current administration's authority, invite public scrutiny, or, and this is key, jeopardize their funding.
That's the conflict of interest right there.
It's huge. The entire system of funding and grants provides zero incentive for public self-correction. If a major researcher admits their policy recommendations caused unintended harm, they might jeopardize future government grants.
Which leads to that sharp, incredibly revealing observation. Peer review ends where institutional risk begins.
It perfectly captures the dynamic. Peer review is great for critiquing methodology and data, but it stops cold when it comes to critiquing the systemic behavior or political alignment of the institutions themselves. That's an existential risk.
So they prioritize institutional stability and funding over intellectual honesty.
It creates a safe zone for institutional error. The system basically tells academics, you can be wrong, but you cannot threaten the structure that pays for your lab. And so the mistakes are allowed to just quietly fade away.
And to understand why these systems were so silent, you have to look at the powerful disincentives facing any individual who thought about speaking up.
Right. The scientific community enforced compliance by making the cost of dissent crystal clear and severe.
If you were a professor or a researcher who voiced legitimate, science-based skepticism about, say, the efficacy of long-term blanket closures, you often faced catastrophic personal and professional consequences.
We saw careers stalled, we saw grants canceled, reputations destroyed, and this was often amplified by media and platforms framing you not just as a dissenter, but as someone who was actively dangerous.
And for an academic, maybe the worst thing is professional ostracism, being excluded from the conferences, the committees, the collaborations that define your entire career.
And that public punishment served a dual purpose. First, it removed the dissenting voice, but second, and much more powerfully, it served as a warning to everyone else.
It's a chilling insight. The punitive environment worked so well that it didn't need to be repeated endlessly. A few high-profile examples were enough.
The system achieved mass compliance through fear of consequence, not through genuine scientific consensus. Everyone else internalized the silent directive. Keep your head down, stick to the script, and protect the institution.
And the lack of accountability today is just the natural result of the punitive conformity that was enforced 3 years ago.
Absolutely. The silence was baked in from the start.
So the vacuum wasn't just engineered from the top down, it was also reinforced from the bottom up by society itself. We have to talk about how everyday people contributed to this lack of reflection.
This involved a massive, often voluntary diffusion of enforcement power down to the citizen level, and is often fueled by a powerful sense of moral certainty.
We saw public shaming campaigns on social media, neighbors reporting neighbors for tiny rule infractions like a child playing outside. We saw aggressive, dehumanizing demands for the exclusion of anyone who disagreed or didn't comply.
This was social engineering, enforced by individual moral zeal. And the lack of reflection here, in hindsight, is just stunning.
The people who enforce the harshest social measures, causing real harm to others, are the least likely to now admit they were wrong, because they truly believed they were acting for the greater good.
Which brings us to that piece of dark humor about their internal justification, capturing the lack of reasoned argument.
They weren't wrong, they were just following vibes.
And the vibes were a powerful psychological shield. They allowed people to bypass the hard work of critical thinking and just default to obedience. And then, crucially, they recast that obedience as virtue.
That's the key psychological insight. So many people fundamentally mistook conformity for virtue. Following the rules, no matter how contradictory, became a substitute for actual moral reflection on the consequences of their actions.
And because obedience was framed as the only moral position, they never had to reflect on the damage their punitive actions caused to others or to the social fabric itself.
To admit error now would mean admitting they weren't actually virtuous during that time, and that's a much bigger personal crisis than just admitting you followed a bad policy.
It is. Which leads us to the emotional core of this whole accountability vacuum.
The collective failure to say 3 very simple but profoundly important phrases in the years since.
The phrases are just, I was wrong, I went too far, or I silenced people unfairly. These are just sentimental gestures. They are the first step in any kind of social repair.
And the fact that they were almost entirely absent shows how rigid that moral positioning became. Why is it so hard for people to say those things?
Because once you adopt a position of high moral superiority, that your actions were necessary to save lives, it's nearly impossible to admit error without shattering your own self-image.
Your identity gets tied to your actions during the crisis. If you publicly shamed someone online for jogging in a park, convinced you were saving lives, admitting you were wrong means admitting you were an agent of unwarranted cruelty.
And that psychological cost is just too steep for most people to bear. It's easier to rationalize it, to say it was necessary at the time, than to face the internal reckoning of having been wrong and harmful.
Which is why we get to that conclusion. Moral superiority doesn't come with a rewind button.
The commitment to being right became a permanent, identity-level commitment, and it blocked any path toward honest self-assessment once the crisis faded.
So we've looked at how all these different groups deflected blame individually. Now let's put it all together to see why accountability was, in a sense, systemically impossible.
It wasn't one failure. It was a well-oiled, multi-layered machine of deflection designed to protect the whole system. You can picture it as a blame relay race.
Right, and no one ever held the baton long enough to get pinned down. The government blamed the tech platforms for not policing content better.
And the platforms blamed government guidance, saying they were just complying with the demands of public health experts.
The media blamed the experts, claiming they were just reporting the current consensus science.
And citizens blamed fear. Or, more importantly, they blamed the non-compliant. They used them as scapegoats for why everything went wrong.
It's completely circular and self-reinforcing, which confirms that powerful conclusion. When blame is everywhere, it settles nowhere.
And this diffusion wasn't an accident. It was the ultimate, highly effective shield that protected the entire power structure from any centralized scrutiny.
Beyond that fragmentation, though, there's an even bigger, more systemic reason why no powerful entity wanted accountability, even years later.
And it all comes down to the fear of precedent.
This is the absolute crux of the institutional silence. Accountability threatens power much more than error ever did. If you hold a formal national reckoning.
You're doing more than just apologizing. You're creating a permanent legal and political precedent for how that kind of power must be checked in the future. And no one in power wants that.
Accountability would undermine the general authority of institutions. It would invite catastrophic lawsuits.
It would force a public admission that the boundaries of executive power were exceeded. And that would hamstring those powers in the next crisis, giving opponents a legal playbook to resist.
So protecting institutional power, the ability to act unilaterally in the next emergency, became the paramount goal.
It trumped any need for social repair or justice for those who were harmed. The price of accountability was determined by the powerful to be higher than the price of silence, so they chose silence.
So, stepping back, what is the toxic lesson that this whole vacuum has taught those in power now and those who'll be in the future?
The lesson is crystal clear, and it's incredibly cynical. It's that in a future crisis, you can repeat these exact same actions.
You can be spectacularly wrong, cause immense harm, violate established norms.
And you will face zero consequences as long as you frame it all as an emergency response. The framing is everything.
It's a permanent license to govern with maximum power, knowing that the system of deflection will prevent any real post-crisis reckoning.
Which gives us that final, cynical punchline that summarizes the new institutional playbook.
Just say safety and walk away.
It's the ultimate trump card. The cost of harm is borne by the public, while the cost of accountability is borne by the institution. And they've ensured that the institutional cost is always zero.
But the lesson wasn't just absorbed by the powerful, it was also absorbed by the public. What did this teach us, the citizens?
We learned some very clear practical instructions. First, silence is safer than dissent. If you speak out, you risk your career and reputation, and no institution will have your back.
Second, compliance is rewarded. You are seen as virtuous, and you are socially protected if you just follow the script.
And third, critical thinking is entirely optional. And in many cases, it's actively counterproductive to your social and professional standing.
The system didn't correct itself.
It congratulated itself, and it made sure that the mechanisms for centralized control and compliant behavior were even more robust for the next time.
This has been a necessary, but, well, a deeply uncomfortable deep dive. If we have to distill the single greatest failure of the era, it wasn't the misinformation.
No, misinformation is always a part of a dynamic crisis.
The single greatest, most dangerous failure was the systemic absence of accountability that followed.
That absence is the real threat, because without accountability, mistakes stop being mistakes. They become strategy. They become institutionalized, low-risk tools that will absolutely be deployed again.
And that structural reality, the guaranteed lack of consequence, is what you really need to take away from this conversation.
And our final provocative thought for you to consider is this. A society that never revisits its wrongs doesn't move forward, it simply reverses them.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this video.
Also, let us know in the comments what really stood out to you in this conversation, and if there's any related topic or a new topic that you would like covered in a future video.